The Colorado wind cut through Jake Morrison's worn duster like a rusted blade, carrying the scent of sage and desperation across the dusty main street of Dead Rock Springs. He sat astride his weary mare, counting the coins in his palm for the third time that morning. $2 silver. That's all that remained of 3 years driving cattle from Texas to Kansas. Jake's weathered hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from the whiskey he'd sworn off 2 days ago. At 32, he looked older, his face carved by sun and hardship, a jagged scar running from his left temple to his jaw, courtesy of a Comanche raiding party 5 years back. His blue eyes, once bright with ambition, had dulled to the color of winter sky. "Come on, Belle," he murmured to his horse, nudging her forward down the rutted street. "Let's see what this dying town has to offer." Dead Rock Springs had seen better days. Half the storefronts stood empty, their windows dark and dusty. The silver mine that had birthed the town played out 2 years ago, leaving behind a collection of stubborn souls too poor or too proud to move on. Jake counted maybe 40 buildings total, including the saloon that dominated the corner with its faded red paint and crooked sign. As he approached the town square, a crowd had gathered near the church steps. Curious despite himself, Jake dismounted and pushed through the cluster of miners, shopkeepers, and drifters. What he saw made his stomach clench. A portly man in a stained vest stood on a wooden crate, gesturing dramatically toward 3 young women huddled together like frightened rabbits. A hand-painted sign proclaimed, "Mail order brides, auction today." "Gentlemen, these fine ladies have traveled all the way from San Francisco seeking respectable husbands," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying the oily smoothness of a snake oil salesman. "Miss Catherine here can cook and sew, perfect for any hard-working man." Jake watched in disgust as men shouted out bids for the terrified blonde girl who couldn't be more than 18. The winning bid of $12 went to a grizzled prospector who looked old enough to be her grandfather. The second woman, a redhead with defiant eyes, went for $8 to a young rancher who at least seemed decent enough, but it was the third woman who caught Jake's attention and wouldn't let go. She was small and delicate, with long black hair that caught the afternoon light and skin that spoke of mixed heritage, Chinese and Irish, he guessed. Her dark eyes held a depth of fear that made Jake's chest tighten with an unfamiliar protective instinct. Unlike the others, she hadn't cried or pleaded. She simply stood there wrapped in a thin shawl, facing her fate with quiet dignity that reminded him of his own mother. "And here we have Miss Sarah," the auctioneer announced. "A bit exotic for some tastes, I'll admit, but she's educated and speaks 2 languages, ideal for a man seeking something different." The crowd grew quieter, and Jake realized with growing anger that most of these men saw her mixed blood as something undesirable. The bidding started slow. $2, called out a voice from the back, a rough-looking man with tobacco-stained teeth and hands that looked like they'd never known honest work. Jake's jaw clenched. He'd seen men like that before, knew what they did to women who had nowhere to run. Without thinking, his hand shot up. $2, he heard himself say, then louder, "I bid $2. The auctioneer looked confused. "Sir, the current bid is $2. You need to bid higher." $2.01, Jake said, digging into his pocket and producing a penny he'd forgotten about. The rough man glared at him but didn't counterbid. After a long moment, the auctioneer's gavel fell. "Sold to the Cowboy for $2.01. As Jake walked toward the platform, he wondered what the hell he'd just done. He had no home, no job, and now no money. But when the woman, Sarah, looked up at him with those dark eyes, he saw something there that made his decision feel less like madness and more like the first right thing he'd done in years. Chapter 2. Whispered Secrets. The Dead Rock Springs Hotel charged 50 cents a night for their finest room, which meant Jake and his unexpected bride would be sleeping under the stars. He led Sarah away from the crowd, acutely aware of the curious stares and whispered comments following them down the street. "Mister," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't quite place. "I should tell you—" "Name's Jake Morrison, ma'am," he interrupted, not ready for whatever she needed to confess. "And right now, I figure we both need some food and a place to think." They walked in silence to the Mercantile, where Jake spent his last penny on a loaf of bread and some dried beef. The shopkeeper, a thin man with kind eyes, studied them both before speaking. "Are you folks looking for work? My brother-in-law runs a spread about 10 miles north. Always needs hands, especially this time of year with winter coming on." Much obliged, Jake nodded. Name and directions? Thomas Henley. Follow the north road past Miller's Creek, then look for the H-Bar-T brand on the gate posts. Outside the store, Jake helped Sarah onto Belle's back before mounting behind her. Her body was stiff with tension, and he could feel her trembling, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell. You warm enough? He asked, as they rode north through the gathering dusk. Yes, she whispered, but her shivering said otherwise. Jake shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The gesture seemed to break something inside her, and she leaned back against his chest with a shuddering sigh. Why? She asked after they'd ridden in silence for several minutes. Why what? Why did you bid on me? You don't know anything about me. Jake considered this. Why had he? Figured we both needed saving, I guess. You from that crowd, me from myself. They found shelter for the night in an abandoned line shack, probably left over from the mining days. Jake got a fire going while Sarah sat wrapped in his coat, staring into the flames. The bread and beef made a meager supper, but it was more than either of them had eaten in days. I need to tell you something, Sarah said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake looked up from where he was arranging his bedroll. All right. She was quiet for so long, he thought she'd changed her mind. Then, without looking at him, she spoke words that made his blood run cold. My real name is Sarah Chen Murphy. 3 months ago, I witnessed a murder in San Francisco's Chinatown. The man who did it. He's called Black Pete Donovan, and he runs half the criminal operations on the West Coast. He saw me watching from my window above the alley. Jake felt the warmth leave his body, despite the crackling fire. Black Pete Donovan. Even in Texas, cowboys knew that name. A man who killed as easily as breathing and had enough money and connections to hunt someone across half the continent. I tried to hide, Sarah continued, her voice steady, but her hands shaking. But he found me anyway. Burned down the boarding house where I was staying. Killed Mrs. Patterson, who'd been kind to me. I barely escaped and used my last money to answer a mail-order bride advertisement, thinking if I could get far enough away, change my name. She finally looked at him then, and Jake saw the truth in her dark eyes. Not just fear, but the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been running for her life. He'll find me eventually, she whispered. He always finds people. And when he does, anyone with me will die too. That's what I should have told you before you spent your money on a dead woman. Jake stared at her across the fire, his mind racing. Black Pete Donovan, a killer with a reputation that stretched from California to Colorado. And now Jake had tied himself to the one person on earth that man wanted dead. The smart thing would be to ride away. Leave her here with some food and water, wish her luck, and put as much distance as possible between himself and the trouble she carried. Instead, Jake reached across the space between them and took her cold hands in his. Sarah, he said quietly, I spent my last $2 on you. I ain't in the habit of throwing away my investments. Chapter 3. The H-Bar-T Ranch. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Colorado landscape, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Jake woke to find Sarah already awake, staring out through a crack in the cabin wall. She'd barely slept, he could tell. The dark circles under her eyes, and the way she startled when he moved, told him she'd spent the night listening for hoofbeats that might herald her doom. Coffee would taste good about now, Jake said softly, trying to ease the tension in her shoulders. Sarah turned toward him, and he was struck again by her quiet beauty. In the morning light, he could see the exhaustion etched in her face, but also a strength that reminded him of the wildflowers that somehow bloomed in the harshest mountain soil. Mr. Morrison, she began formally, last night I told you things that put you in danger. You should reconsider, Jake, he interrupted, standing and brushing off his pants. If we're married, might as well use my Christian name. Are we? Married, I mean? The question hung in the air between them like morning mist. Jake considered this. They'd exchanged no vows, had no preacher present, signed no papers. But in the eyes of the law and the community, a man who bought a mail-order bride at auction was expected to marry her. More than that, something in his chest tightened at the thought of her not being his to protect. Far as I'm concerned, we are, he said simply. Lest you object to being Mrs. Morrison. A ghost of a smile crossed Sarah's lips, the first he'd seen from her. I suppose Sarah Morrison sounds better than Sarah Chen Murphy when it comes to hiding from dangerous men. They reached the H-Bar-T ranch by mid-morning, Belle carrying them both across rolling grassland dotted with cattle bearing the distinctive brand. The main house was a solid 2-story structure built of local stone and timber, with a wide porch that spoke of prosperity without ostentation. Outbuildings and corrals spread out behind it, and Jake counted at least a dozen horses in the nearest pasture. Thomas Henley turned out to be a man in his 50s with graying hair and the weathered hands of someone who'd worked cattle all his life. He stood on his porch watching them approach, his wife Martha appearing beside him, a plump woman with kind eyes and graying brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You'd be the folks Bill Peterson mentioned might be coming by," Henley called out as Jake helped Sarah down from Bell. "Yes, sir. Jake Morrison, and this is my wife Sarah. Looking for honest work if you've got it." Henley's eyes took in Jake's worn but well-maintained gear, the way he handled his horse, and the respectful distance he maintained from Sarah despite their obvious newlywed status. What he saw must have satisfied him, because he nodded. "Can always use a good hand, especially one with a wife who might help Martha with the housework. Winter's coming hard this year, and we'll be feeding cattle through till spring." He paused, studying Sarah more closely. "You folks had breakfast?" "Not much of one," Jake admitted. "Martha, set 2 more places. We'll talk business after we get some food in these people." The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of bacon, eggs, and fresh biscuits. Martha Henley bustled around, clearly in her element, while Sarah sat quietly at the scrubbed pine table. Jake noticed how Sarah's eyes tracked every movement, every doorway, a hunted animal's habit he recognized from his own darker days. "So where you folks from?" Martha asked as she set down plates heaped with more food than Jake had seen in weeks. "Texas originally," Jake answered. "Been working cattle drives the last few years. Sarah's from California." If the Henleys noticed Sarah's mixed heritage, they were too polite to comment. Thomas asked practical questions about Jake's experience with livestock, winter feeding, and fence repair. The work would pay $30 a month plus room and board for both of them. It was more than fair. "There's a cabin about a quarter-mile from the main house," Martha said to Sarah. "It's small but sound. Previous hand kept it clean. You'll have privacy but be close enough if you need anything." "That's very kind," Sarah said quietly. It was the first time she'd spoken since introductions, and Jake heard the relief in her voice. After the meal, Thomas showed them to the cabin. It was indeed small, just one room with a stone fireplace, a bed, a table, and 2 chairs. But the roof was solid and the walls chinked tight against the wind. More importantly, it had good sightlines in all directions and only one door to watch. "We'll send over some supplies to get you started," Thomas said. "Jake, you can start tomorrow morning. We're moving the herd to winter pasture." As the rancher walked away, Sarah sank onto the bed and buried her face in her hands. The past 2 days had finally caught up with her. "Hey now," Jake said awkwardly, sitting beside her but not touching. "It's going to be all right." "How can you say that?" Her voice was muffled by her hands. "You don't understand what Black Pete is capable of. He burned down a building just to flush me out, killed an innocent old woman who never hurt anyone, and I've brought that evil right to these good people's doorstep." Jake was quiet for a moment, then reached out and gently pulled her hands away from her face. "Sarah, look at me." When she did, he saw tears tracking down her cheeks. "I've been running from things too," he said quietly. "Different things than you, maybe, but running all the same. Had a ranch once in East Texas. Wife named Rebecca, prettiest girl in 3 counties. We were going to raise cattle and children and grow old together." Sarah's tears slowed as she listened. "Comanche raiding party hit us one spring morning in '77. I was out checking fence. Came back to find—" He swallowed hard. "Found Rebecca and our unborn child both gone. Burned the house down around them." "Oh, Jake," Sarah whispered. "Point is, I've spent 5 years running from that pain, drinking it away, fighting it away, working myself near to death to forget it. But sitting here with you, protecting you, it's the first time since Rebecca died that I've felt like maybe there's still some good I can do in this world." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful ranch yard. "Black Pete Donovan may be a dangerous man, but he's still just a man, and men can be stopped." Chapter 4. Shadows on the Horizon. 3 weeks at the H-Bar T had given both Jake and Sarah something neither had expected to find: peace. Jake threw himself into the ranch work with the dedication of a man grateful for honest employment, while Sarah found solace in helping Martha Henley with cooking, mending, and the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running through the approaching winter. The work was hard but satisfying. Jake helped move the cattle to winter pasture, repaired miles of fence, and spent long days in the saddle under the vast Colorado sky. His hands, soft from too much whiskey and too little honest work, developed fresh calluses. His body, weakened by neglect, grew strong again. Sarah bloomed under Martha Henley's motherly attention. The older woman had lost 2 children in infancy and seemed to pour her maternal instincts into caring for the young bride. She taught Sarah to make bread that rose properly in the thin mountain air, to preserve vegetables for winter, and to shoot the old Colt revolver that Thomas insisted she carry. "Every ranch wife needs to know how to protect herself and her home," Martha said matter-of-factly, as she showed Sarah how to clean and load the weapon. Bears, mountain lions, and men who forgot their manners, they all speak the same language. In the evenings, Jake and Sarah would sit before their fireplace, she mending clothes while he carved or cleaned his gear. They talked quietly about small things, the weather, the cattle, Martha's latest attempts to fatten them both up. Neither spoke of the growing warmth between them, the way their eyes lingered when they thought the other wasn't looking, or the careful distance they maintained in their shared bed. Jake found himself studying Sarah when she wasn't aware, the graceful way she moved around their small cabin, the concentration on her face when she read from one of Martha's books by firelight, the way she hummed softly while cooking. He was falling in love with his accidental wife, and the realization terrified him more than Black Pete Donovan ever could. For her part, Sarah watched Jake with growing wonder. She'd expected a rough, possibly brutal man. Most of the cowboys she'd encountered in San Francisco had been crude and loud. Instead, she'd found someone gentle and thoughtful, who never raised his voice, who asked rather than demanded, and who treated her with a respect she'd never experienced from any man. The illusion of safety shattered on a gray November morning. Jake was mending fence in the north pasture when he spotted the dust cloud on the horizon. 3 riders moving fast and purposeful toward the ranch. His blood turned to ice water when he recognized the lead rider through Thomas Henley's field glasses. Marcus Webb, Black Pete Donovan's top lieutenant, a man who'd earned his reputation by never failing to bring back whoever his boss wanted found. Jake had seen Webb once in Dodge City, watched him gun down an unarmed man in broad daylight, and walk away untouched because the local sheriff was in Donovan's pocket. Jake spurred his horse toward the ranch house, his mind racing. Webb wouldn't have come alone or unprepared. If he was here, it meant they'd tracked Sarah somehow, maybe through the mail-order bride agency, maybe through simple dogged detective work. Either way, it meant their time was up. He found Sarah in Martha's kitchen, helping prepare lunch for the ranch hands. One look at his face told her everything she needed to know. "How long?" she asked quietly. "Maybe an hour." 3 men, including Marcus Webb. Martha looked between them, confused but sensing the danger. "Who's Marcus Webb?" "Someone very bad, Mrs. Henley," Sarah said, untying her apron with steady hands. "And I've brought him to your door. I'm so sorry." "Now hold on," Martha began, but Thomas appeared in the doorway, having seen Jake's urgent ride back to the house. "Trouble coming?" the rancher asked. Jake nodded grimly. 3 men looking for my wife. They're the kind who won't take no for an answer and won't care who gets hurt." Thomas's face hardened. "How long we got? Not long enough to run?" "There may be an hour out. Then we make a stand," Thomas said simply. "This is my land, my family, my people. Nobody rides onto my ranch making threats." "Mr. Henley, you don't understand," Sarah protested. "These men are killers. They'll burn your house down, murder everyone here just to get to me. You have to let me go to them." "Like hell," Jake snarled, his hand dropping to his gun. "I didn't marry you just to hand you over to killers." Thomas looked at his wife, and some silent communication passed between them. Martha nodded firmly. "Sarah, honey," Martha said, putting her arms around the younger woman, "we knew something was chasing you the day you arrived. The way you watched the windows, jumped at sudden sounds. We chose to take you in anyway. This is still America," Thomas added, checking his rifle. "A man or woman has the right to start over, leave the past behind. If these fellows think they can ride onto my property and take one of mine, they're about to learn different." As if summoned by his words, the ranch hands began appearing, drawn by the urgency in Jake's return and Thomas's grim expression. 6 men in total, all of them loyal to Thomas Henley and not the type to back down from a fight. Jake felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the approaching danger. For the first time in 5 years, he was part of something worth fighting for. Not just Sarah, though he'd die before letting Webb take her, but this family, this place, these good people who'd chosen to stand with them against the darkness. Webb and his men appeared at the ranch gate as the sun reached its zenith, three hard-faced killers on tired horses. They rode slowly into the yard, hands resting casually on their weapons, eyes taking in the ranch hands positioned at strategic points around the buildings. Marcus Webb himself was a tall, lean man with dead gray eyes and a mustache that couldn't hide the cruel twist of his mouth. He wore expensive clothes that marked him as more than just another gunfighter. This was Donovan's top man, dangerous and smart. "Afternoon," Webb called out pleasantly, as if he were a traveling salesman rather than a stone-cold killer. "Beautiful spread you've got here. I'm looking for a woman. Chinese features, about 20 years old. Goes by Sarah Chen. Heard she might have passed through these parts." Thomas stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. "Don't know anyone by that name, friend. You're welcome to water your horses and move on." Webb's smile never wavered, but his eyes went colder. "See, that's strange because I tracked her to Dead Springs 3 weeks ago. Fellow there said she was bought by a cowboy at a bride auction. Cowboy matching your man, there's description." He nodded toward Jake, who stood beside Sarah on the porch, his hand resting on his Colt. "Now I'm a reasonable man," Webb continued, his voice still conversational. "Mr. Donovan just wants to have a conversation with Miss Chen about something she might have seen in San Francisco. Pay her well for her time, then she's free to go about her business." "And if she doesn't want to have that conversation?" Jake asked. Webb's smile widened, showing too many teeth. "Oh, she will, Mr. Donovan can be very persuasive." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Sarah stepped forward, chin raised defiantly. "I know what Black Pete Donovan does to people who see too much," she called out. "I saw what he did to Tommy Chen, my cousin, when Tommy witnessed one of his business meetings. Found Tommy floating in the bay 3 days later. Unfortunate," Webb acknowledged, "but business is business. Now, you can come with us peaceful-like, or we can do this the hard way. Your choice." It was Thomas Henley who answered, his voice carrying the authority of a man defending his own land. "Mister, you've got about 10 seconds to ride off my property before I decide you're trespassing with intent to harm my people. After that, you'll be talking to my Winchester instead of me." Webb's pleasant mask finally slipped, revealing the killer underneath. "Old man, you have no idea who you're crossing. Black Pete Donovan owns half the territory from here to California. You really want to make an enemy of him over some yellow whore?" The insult hit Jake like a physical blow. His Colt was in his hand before he even realized he'd drawn it, the hammer cocked and aimed at Webb's heart. "Apologize to my wife," Jake said quietly, "or I'll kill you where you sit." The ranch yard went silent except for the wind whistling through the fence posts. 6 ranch hands with rifles faced 3 killers with reputation and money behind them. It was the kind of moment that could go either way, balanced on a knife's edge between talking and dying. Webb studied Jake's face and apparently decided he was looking at a man with nothing left to lose, the most dangerous kind. "My apologies to Mrs. Morrison," he said with mock courtesy. "No offense intended." Jake didn't lower his gun. "Now ride out." "Oh, we'll go," Webb agreed, already backing his horse toward the gate. "But this isn't over, mister. Donovan doesn't give up easy, and he's got a long memory. We'll be seeing you folks again real soon." As the 3 riders disappeared back the way they'd come, Sarah sagged against the porch rail. The confrontation was over, but everyone knew Webb was right. This was far from finished. Chapter 5. The Final Stand. The attack came 3 nights later, just before dawn, when the world was at its darkest and most vulnerable. Jake woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of horses moving quietly through the ranch yard. He'd been sleeping light since Webb's visit, one ear always listening for trouble. "Sarah," he whispered urgently, shaking her awake, "get dressed, quick and quiet." She was instantly alert, the habits of 3 months on the run taking over. While she pulled on her clothes, Jake peered through the window. Orange light flickered from the direction of the barn. They'd started with fire, hoping to create chaos and flush out their targets in the confusion. "How many?" Sarah asked, checking the loads in the Colt Martha had taught her to use. "Can't tell. More than 3 this time." Jake strapped on his gun belt and grabbed his Winchester. "They're trying to burn us out." A sharp whistle came from the direction of the main house, Thomas Henley's signal that he was awake and ready. Similar whistles answered from the bunkhouse and other buildings around the ranch. Whatever else happened, they wouldn't be facing this alone. Jake and Sarah slipped out the back of their cabin and made their way toward the main house, using the pre-arranged route they'd planned during the tense days following Webb's visit. The smell of smoke grew stronger, and Jake could see flames dancing in the barn's loft. They'd almost reached the house when a figure stepped out of the shadows, one of Webb's men, rifle raised. Jake dove sideways, pulling Sarah with him as the Winchester cracked and a bullet whined past his ear. Sarah's Colt barked twice in quick succession, the muzzle flashes lighting up her determined face. The gunman stumbled backward and fell, clutching his shoulder. "Nice shooting," Jake said grimly. "Martha's a good teacher," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. They reached the main house to find it had become a fortress. Martha Henley crouched behind an overturned table near a front window, her own rifle ready. Thomas was at the back door, watching the approaches. The ranch hands had positioned themselves in the bunkhouse and other buildings, creating overlapping fields of fire. "Barn's gone," Thomas reported as they slipped inside. "But they haven't made a move on the house yet. Might be waiting for more light." "Or more men," Jake added. He'd been thinking about this moment for 3 days, running through possibilities and strategies. "Webb's not stupid. He knows we're ready for him now." A voice called out from the yard, Webb himself, sounding as pleasant as ever despite the burning barn behind him. "Folks in the house, this doesn't have to end with anyone else getting hurt. Send out Sarah Chen, and we'll ride away peaceful-like. You've got my word on it." Thomas snorted. "Like we'd trust the word of a man who burns barns in the night." "What's your plan, Mr. Morrison?" Webb continued. "You going to keep my woman hidden away forever? Mr. Donovan's got all the time and money in the world. He can wait. Bring in more men. Make life real unpleasant for your friends here." Sarah looked around at the faces of the people who'd chosen to stand with her. Martha Henley, grim-faced but determined. Thomas, checking his ammunition. The ranch hands visible through the windows. Loyal men who'd signed on to work cattle, not fight killers. "He's right," she said quietly. "This can't go on. Every day I stay puts all of you in more danger." "Sarah, no," Jake said sharply. She turned to face him, and he saw something in her dark eyes he'd never seen before. Not fear or desperation, but resolve. "Jake, I've been running for 3 months. Before that, I was hiding in my room above that alley in Chinatown, afraid to live my life because of what I might see. I'm tired of being afraid." She moved to the window and called out into the gray pre-dawn light. "Mr. Webb, I'll make you a deal." "Sarah, don't," Martha pleaded, but Sarah was already continuing. "Single combat. Your best gun against mine. Winner takes all." Webb's laughter echoed across the yard. "Lady, this isn't some dime novel. We're not going to settle this with a duel." "Why not?" Sarah challenged. "You afraid your reputation can't handle being outgunned by a woman?" The laughter stopped. Webb's voice, when it came again, was cold as winter wind. "Who's your champion, sweetheart?" Sarah looked at Jake, love and trust shining in her eyes. "My husband." Jake felt his heart clench. He'd been fast once before the whiskey and the wandering, but Webb was a professional killer, probably the best gun in Donovan's organization. This wasn't courage Sarah was showing. It was suicide by proxy. "I won't do it," he said flatly. "Yes, you will," Sarah said softly, taking his hands in hers. "Because you're the only man I've ever trusted to protect me. Because you spent your last $2 on a stranger and never asked for anything in return. Because I love you, Jake Morrison, and I believe in you." The words hit him like a physical force. In all the weeks they'd been together, neither had spoken of love, though it had grown between them like wildflowers after rain. "Sarah, I saw you practice," she continued. "When you thought no one was watching. You're faster than you think, and more importantly, you're fighting for something he isn't." Webb's voice came again from outside. "Well, do we have a deal?" Jake looked around the room at the faces watching him. Thomas Henley nodded slightly. The older man understood what this meant, the weight of it. Martha had tears in her eyes, but didn't protest. The ranch hands visible through the windows waited for his decision. "All right," Jake called out finally. "Single combat, but not just me and your gun. You and me, Webb. Winner takes all." "Jake Morrison against Marcus Webb," Webb agreed, and there was something like pleasure in his voice. "Main Street of Dead Rock Springs, high noon today. That gives us both time to prepare." "And if I win?" Jake asked. "You win, we ride away, and never come back. Sarah Chen disappears far as we're concerned. Mr. Donovan finds other things to occupy his time." And if you win, when I win, the woman comes with us. Everyone else gets to live with the memory of watching their hero die in the dirt. The bargain was struck as the sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Both sides prepared for the showdown that would end it all. Jake spent the morning cleaning and checking his colt, running through the familiar ritual that had kept him alive, through range wars and cattle town confrontations. His hands were steady, his mind clear. Whatever happened in Dead Rock Springs, he'd face it as the man Sarah believed him to be. Sarah sat beside him, occasionally offering quiet words of encouragement, but mostly just being present. They didn't talk about what would happen if he lost. Some things were too terrible to voice. At 11:30, they rode into Dead Rock Springs together, followed by Thomas Henley and several ranch hands as witnesses. Word had spread, and half the town had turned out to watch the confrontation. Webb was already there, standing casually in the middle of the dusty street, his expensive coat unbuttoned for easy access to his gun. Jake dismounted and kissed Sarah gently, tasting salt from the single tear that had escaped her control. "Whatever happens," he whispered, "I want you to know, these last few weeks with you have been the happiest of my life." "Then make sure there are many more," she whispered back. Jake walked to the center of the street, stopping about 20 paces from Webb. The killer was smiling, confident in his abilities and reputation. Behind him, his remaining men watched from the saloon porch. "You sure about this, Morrison?" Webb called out. "Not too late to change your mind. Let the lady come quiet-like." "I'm sure," Jake replied, settling into the familiar stance he'd learned in a dozen frontier towns. The church bell tolled noon, its bronze voice carrying across the silent street. On the final stroke, both men moved. Webb was fast, faster than anyone Jake had ever faced. The killer's gun cleared leather in a smooth, practiced motion that spoke of countless draws, countless kills. But Jake Morrison was fighting for more than reputation or money. He was fighting for love, for redemption, for the chance to be the man his Sarah believed him to be. His Colt seemed to leap into his hand of its own accord, the hammer falling as naturally as breathing. 2 shots echoed across Dead Rock Springs, so close together they almost sounded like one. Webb stood for a moment, his smoking gun pointed at the ground, a look of surprise crossing his face. Then he crumpled forward, a spreading red stain on his expensive shirt. Jake remained standing, his own gun smoking in his steady hand. The bullet had grazed his left shoulder, burning like fire, but it was nothing that would keep him from walking back to his wife. Webb's men, seeing their leader dead in the dust, mounted their horses and rode out without a word. The contract was finished, the debt paid. Sarah ran to Jake, tears streaming down her face as she threw her arms around him. Behind them, the people of Dead Rock Springs and the H-Bar-T ranch began to cheer. "Is it over?" Sarah whispered against his chest. Jake held her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the solid reality of her in his arms. "It's over," he confirmed. "And we can stop running now." 3 months later, on a bright February morning, Jake and Sarah Morrison stood before the preacher in Dead Rock Springs' little church and spoke the vows that made official what had been true in their hearts since that first night in the line shack. Thomas and Martha Henley stood as witnesses, beaming like proud parents. The ranch had prospered through the winter, and Jake had been offered a partnership in the operation. Sarah had started a small school for the children of local ranchers and miners, her education and gentle manner making her beloved throughout the territory. Sometimes, late at night when the wind howled down from the mountains, Sarah would wake with a start, listening for the sound of horses that never came. Jake would hold her until the fear passed, whispering words of love and protection that slowly convinced her that some stories really could have happy endings. Black Pete Donovan, according to reports that filtered back from California, had indeed found other things to occupy his attention. The death of Marcus Webb had sent a message that even his long arm couldn't reach everywhere, and there were easier victims than a woman protected by a fast gun and loyal friends. Jake Morrison had spent his last $2 on a bride and found something worth more than all the silver in Colorado, a second chance at love, at family, at being the man he'd always hoped to be, and in the end, that was the best investment he'd ever made.